It's pretty observable that the Alabama fans stayed home and the Aggie fans came to church today. I intentionally did not say the words Texas A&M during church because whenever you say that.
I was expecting you to ask for prayers for birthdays, anniversaries, and Aggie fans. I'm disappointed you didn't call it.
Humility, you're learning humility. Deep Thanksgiving this morning. Totally, I don't even think did any Aggie fan expect to win? I mean, no. Quite a game. Fun college football Saturday. All right.
Not a slaughter. Like, I was not even expecting a game. It was actually, I was like, Grace was texting us play on play. It was pretty fun.
Well, I have a dear friend who went to Alabama, who is the biggest Alabama fan I know, and he made the trip down to the game last night. I have not heard from him. I don't think I'm going to. All right, the group at camp is a great group this weekend. Everybody wanted me to tell you guys thanks for the support and whatnot. Really, really top-notch group of folks. 38, I said this in the service, there were 38 folks who went on that mission trip. That's the largest mission trip we've ever had from our parish at a time when, you guys can look around, attendance is down and participation is down. So that's a wonderful group and a wonderful blessing. And the people that were down there were having a great time. So God provided for us. I just want to kind of summarize where we've been so far in this class. So we've been doing this class about 6 weeks. It's an Apologetics class. And I wasn't here last week. I know Father Matthew taught the class, and the main thing I heard is that he had several jokes that bombed. That's all I know that happened. Because I was like, how'd it go? And he's like, man, I was swinging and missing. So I'm not entirely sure of everything that was said last week, but I think I have a decent idea. So in apologetics, there's a couple of different places to start. And for the purposes of this course, what we've decided to do is start with the person of Jesus. And so we spent a couple of weeks and we talked about C.S. Lewis's approach with the Lord. And you're talking to somebody who's a little bit skeptical about the Christian faith. And so starting at the very heart of the Christian faith is a good strategy. It's not where every apologist starts. There's lots of other philosophical arguments and arguments from creation and everything else. And we can get to some of those as the course goes on. But for the purposes of this class, we've said, for someone who's skeptical and you're trying to talk to them about why you're a Christian, they have to figure out if they want to give this any thought whatsoever. And a lot of people, of course, would prefer not to, leave me alone. I don't want to think about this. I'd like to live my life paying attention to other things. But for the people that actually want to think through it, C.S. Lewis is very helpful here, and we talked all through that either you can't just sort of say, well, Jesus is a nice teacher, and now let me go back to my business, right? That's not an intellectually honest approach to the person of Christ. And then we said, okay, well, let's say you can get them, you can talk with them about either he's the Lord, or he's lying to you, or he's some type of insane, cult leader. But somebody can genuinely sort of see those options and then say, yeah, but is the New Testament really reliable? Isn't it just a book of cleverly devised myths, And so we spent some time talking about the manuscripts and how the manuscripts are in agreement with one another. And if these were just things that people were making up along the way, there would be differences in the manuscripts, okay? So all these ancient manuscripts, like if Joe Hodges was copying his manuscript and he's like, yeah, but wouldn't it be cool if Jesus did this? He would write that into the story, and then, Carl Lepiska would be writing his manuscript and he'd just be copying along. Well, we would see those variations, and we'd start to see a lot of them over time if the copyists were just making things up. But what we have in all these ancient manuscripts is remarkable agreement to the different authors of the New Testament. One thing that skeptics will tell you sometimes is, yeah, but these books are written so long after the fact, and then, when we get a manuscript of it, it's several hundred years later. I just made the point in one of the classes that, if you think that Plato or Homer, anything from antiquity, the original document, the earliest manuscript we have, for instance, for Plato, is 1,200 years after the dude lived, okay? So you can say this represents none of the thought of Plato, but I don't know anyone alive today who says that. Historians don't say that, philosophers don't say that. They engage with what Plato wrote. And it's 1,200 years between the earliest document we have and when the guy lived, okay? So it's just kind of the way things worked in antiquity. You got one guy who's, copying what one guy did, and then the next guy's copying it, and the next guy, there isn't a printing press, there isn't a, Microsoft Office, there isn't email. And so the way things work in antiquity is a little bit different than the way they work now. And, somebody tweets something that they've thought about for, less than 3 seconds, and then, 2 million people retweet it, this is how the internet, of course, is full of all kinds of, everything on the internet's true, right? So, the internet's full of bad ideas because everybody and their dog, the retweet, this is the ancient version of the retweet, except they had to sit there and copy it line by line, right? So we just talked about that the New Testament is actually probably a narrower time frame in terms of the earliest manuscripts we have from the original documents. I feel like that's a little bit of a confusing argument. Does everybody follow that particular argument? Okay. So this is a really key point, right? If the New Testament is reliable, then you got to grapple with what it says about Jesus. And so that's why we're belaboring this point, because the first point is who is Jesus? What do you make of him? And the second point is, what is the New Testament? What do you make of it? Okay, and just honestly, you've got to wrestle with it. Now, I believe what Father Matthew was talking about last week, and those of you that were here can help me, was he was talking about, is there evidence, and we looked at a little of this early in the class, but is there evidence outside of the New Testament from different writers who aren't New Testament insiders, let's say? Is there evidence that actually corroborates what is in the New Testament? Is that what he talked about last week?
Yeah.
Okay, that's good to know. And did he say that there was, I hope? Just kidding, he's not here. So we have a lot of what you might call kind of second generation apostles. We have writings from them. So guys who learned from the original apostles, okay? So Ignatius of Antioch and Polycarp are particularly helpful. There's another guy, Justin Martyr, who's kind of the church's first apologist. These guys are all writing in by the year probably 115, 120 AD. So they're alive when St. John is alive, for instance, and they can talk to him. All right. So the chain of transmission is just from an older person to a younger person. That's all it is. Okay. So St. John, he's kind of getting up there in years, and they put him out on the Isle of Patmos. I called Walter Copeland, who does a lot with our finances, the other day. Like, hey, Father John, I'm on the island of Patmos. I'm like, how's that going? It's really cool, actually. I'm like, oh, okay. I was like, well, why are you answering my call then? So the other thing that I think he might have talked about is a little bit about the archaeological evidence that continues to confirm the veracity of the statements in the New Testament. Did y'all talk about archaeology at all?
Yeah.
This is something that I'm really personally interested in. I think you know that for a lot of post-Enlightenment historians, they believed that the city of Jericho was completely fictitious because they couldn't find any evidence of it. All right, so they just believed that this whole city of Jericho and all of the Bible stories were just completely made up. And you can find this written all over the place. place. And then they started digging, and sure enough, there's an entire city right where it's supposed to be. Okay, so what's that?
They found the tree.
Well, we went through Jericho. Of course, in Jericho is where Zacchaeus was, and he climbs the sycamore tree to see our Lord, and they tried to tell us that it was the same sycamore tree that Zacchaeus climbed. I was like, I'm going to go ahead and disagree with that one. Sycamore trees live to be 2,000 years old. On the other hand, olive trees do live to be that long, and the olive trees in the Garden of Gethsemane are these big things that their trunks are, as big around as this table, and they're all gnarled and all that. And it's very possible that some of the trees there were there on the many nights where our Lord went to the Garden of Gethsemane, but certainly it's possible on the last night of his life. About 4 years ago, they did a huge cleanup of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is in the old city of Jerusalem, and it sort of dominates what's called the Christian quarter of Jerusalem. And inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is both the place where our Lord was crucified and the place where he was buried. Okay, it's a big church, and it's very confusing the way it's laid out. You can tell it's, built over many different generations. But you got to walk up this little staircase, and there is Mount Calvary, or what they think was Mount Calvary. And you can go and venerate the place where our Lord's crucified, and you go down. There's the anointing stone where they pulled him off and anointed his body and wrapped it for burial. And then over here is where the women stood, and there's a little icon where the women stand. And then there's this big kind of rotunda, I guess might be the best way to say it. Let me see if I can, yeah. So this big giant rotunda in here, and there is this little structure that is built inside the rotunda, and in this little walkway, I don't know what you want to call it, you got to get past some monks who smell pretty bad and look at you in a mean way, but you got to get in there, and in there there's this little shelf where they believe that this was where the original tomb of Jesus was. So they would have wrapped his body up, put it on the shelf, and then of course it's in a cave in the side of a mountain. All right. Now they cut away. The mountain's not there anymore. The cave's not there anymore. But the original little burial shelf is there, and it's inside there. And you go in there, and they give you 3 seconds to say a prayer before the monk comes in. It's like, you must leave now. And you're like, oh man, I want to say a prayer. So in 2017, they did this huge renovation, and for those of you that were there in the group that went from St. Lawrence, that place was black, if you remember. Like inside, it was nasty. It hadn't been cleaned in a whole long time. Well, now it's white inside there. Like I've been back after the cleaning, and it is truly remarkable how different it looks. So they get this permission. National Geographic's got their cameras there, and what they're going to do is there's this shelf that everybody gets to go in. And what they're going to do is, for the first time in anyone who's alive today, they're going to pull up this shelf, and they're going to try to figure out what's going on underneath it. We're going to clean this little shelf where it's at the tomb of Jesus. I think I have a picture of this. Yeah, okay. So they get in there. They get permission to get in there. Now, this is probably the holiest site in the world, so they give them 60 hours. You got 60 hours. You send your guys in, and they can clean it up, and they can find and take pictures or whatever they want. All right. So they got the Pope, live via satellite, eating his mozzarella, whatever he's doing over in Rome, and he's watching as they're doing this. And there's all these monks around. Church of the Holy Sepulchre has tons of both Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox monks that are in there all the time. And they're saying they're chanting their prayers, and they couldn't care less if you're there or not. So it's interesting because a lot of people were really skeptical about this being the potential burial site of Jesus until they lift the lid and they start looking around in there, and what they find are all these first century markings on the stones that are there, the original first century stones that are underneath this little like cap thing. Let me just go back real quick here. So like they built this little shelf above this, and you see him, you know, this guy is in there trying to deconstruct it and clean it up. So this is like the Pope cam. We got a snapshot from, we could say. And you can see there's this beautiful, you can't really see in this picture, but this beautiful carving of the risen Christ and two angels right there. So they get in there, and much to the archaeologists' surprise, they find all these first century markings. So all these skeptics were certain that this probably wasn't the place. And then they start pulling the mortar that was holding the shelf in place, and they testing it and dating it. And of course, it goes back to the exact timeline that we've always believed was, I mean, this guy Eusebius writes an early church history, and you remember the Emperor Constantine in the year 314 issues the Edict of Milan, and that's a real turning point in Christianity. Christianity is legal. His mother, St. Helen, is a big influence on that. Helen's a believer in Jesus Christ. So she goes to the Holy Land, and she starts looking for the tomb of Jesus. So they identify this as the place. They start talking to local people, like, hey, where was the tomb of Jesus? And they're like, right here. So they go there, and this is the exact spot that Christians have thought for all these centuries that our Lord's tomb was. And then they go and they find all these, you know, first century writings that say things like, he is not here, he is risen. So, I mean, by the year 100, people are visiting this particular location and writing things like, he is not here, he is risen on the walls, okay? Does it mean for sure that this was the tomb of Jesus and he was risen from the dead? I don't know, but I think it helps a lot, right? Like if you're just looking for evidence. So time and time again, one of the things that we're finding is like, they don't know really all the stuff that is all over Jerusalem. The two times that I've been, the second time, there's this whole new huge site just south of the temple called the City of David. It wasn't there at all the first time. There were houses built there the first time I went. Second time, it's this new huge archaeological site. Part of the original city of Jerusalem was just underneath all these, you know, swing sets and, you know, backyards and stuff. They wanted to, the true story is they wanted to widen the road, and as they began to dig, they're like, what is this? And so they're like, okay, let's close it back up and call the archaeological department. And they're like, nope, you can't build your road here. And so like they keep finding things like that. There's all these projects on backlog. So we're learning like in real time tons and tons about the ancient world. And one of the things that I just want to make sure you know is that every time we find more, it actually just confirms more of what we already knew from another source. There hasn't been a single dig where we're like, wow, that really undid everything. It just hasn't happened. The other thing that was cool is in the renovation of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, there are all these other little tombs that they have preserved that were there, that were near Jesus' tomb. And you can actually go into the tomb. So that was something that I didn't do the first time, but it's really cool because you get a good idea. It's really hard looking at this thing to get any idea of like, I don't get it, you know, how was this his tomb? Because of course this is, you know, built, I think this is probably built, you know, by the Crusaders or something like that, you know.
So it's a church inside of a church.
The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is kind of that way, where there's all these little nooks and crannies, and there's like an altar there, and you're like, something cool happened there. I just don't know what it was, you know. And then, you know, it's, you know, turns out that, you know, Mary Magdalene did something there or whatever, you know. So archaeology continues to help us, and it's one of those pursuits that Christians have been after in the Holy Land a lot over the last many decades, that they want to keep digging because every time we do, we keep finding stuff that confirms what the Bible tells us. There was another point I wanted to make here before and maybe it's not in my notes. Maybe I'll get to it. Okay, so establishing this, that the New Testament writers are telling you something that's credible and that something that's accurate, is a huge, huge thing in apologetics. And sort of the basic question, like, are they telling the truth? And let's begin just by noticing that the documents do themselves claim to be written by those who were alive at the time of the events, right? So the documents themselves claim to be eyewitness accounts, all right? And you can see a couple of quotes. There are other ones from the New Testament, but ran out of room. All right, so that's an important piece. Now you're saying, like, of course they claim to be eyewitness accounts, but that itself, the fact that the people who are writing the document are saying, I saw this with my own eyes, turns out to be a really, really important part of do we understand this to be accurate and credible? All right. The other thing is the New Testament authors, they write a lot about people that were alive. They write a lot about dates. They write a lot of cultural details about the washing of the pots. And you can think of like the wedding at Cana, the stone jars, the 6 stone jars. They write a lot about customs. They write a lot about opinions. Like there's a lot of first century information that makes its way into the Gospels and into certainly the Acts of the Apostles. So the thing is that time and time again, as we research these things, they prove to be accurate. Okay, so this itself is an important thing. If the documents contained all these errors, then it might lead us to the conclusion, okay, these guys didn't really know their stuff. Somebody's writing this, a couple hundred years later. They didn't really understand the customs of the time. They didn't understand the people. They didn't understand the place. They didn't understand the dates. Right? So if you and I were to try to write, sort of an intimate narrative of the Civil War, undoubtedly we would get all kinds of little things wrong, even though, we studied a little bit about it in school. We weren't there. We didn't talk to anybody who was there. But what the New Testament documents tell us over and over again is turns out to be accurate. So if it's accurate in one place that can be verified by historical data or data that we know to be customs of the time, that would lead us to the truth that these are not a later creation. Everybody follow that argument here? Everybody bored to death yet? One of these examples, all right, so probably this is like if you're talking to someone there, this is the first example that most skeptics would give is, and we know this one because we've all watched Charlie Brown Christmas over and over again, and maybe you've been to church on Christmas Eve where we read from Luke's narrative of Jesus' birth, but Luke begins the birth narrative with familiar words. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. I hope this is familiar to everybody, right? You've heard this at least once. Okay. So if you look at Wikipedia and you talk to some people, they're like, sorry, Quirinius wasn't governor of Syria until the year 6 AD, so there's no way that Luke can be accurate. All right, that's what they're going to tell you. And then if you're talking to somebody who's done a little bit of reading, they're going to tell you, well, Matthew says that Jesus was born during the reign of Herod. And we think Herod either died, depending on which version of Josephus' translation you're going with, in 4 BC or in 1 BC. All right? So basically they'll tell you there's no way that Matthew and Luke can be in agreement because, everybody's following me on this? Mm-hmm. Herod dies before Quirinius is governor of Syria. And so then they're like, look how stupid you Christians are. You don't even know basic history. And your book is full of made-up facts. Again, archaeology helps us here because, so something important to know, all right? And I hope I've established this, but if I haven't, and you hear nothing else in the class, the historical documents from this time are limited, all right? We don't have complete histories, and any historian's going to tell you that. So, do we have a complete picture of what life was like in ancient Rome? No. We got this guy Tacitus who tells us some stuff. We got one, basically, and then we got some stuff from maybe written by Caesar. So we got like 2 sources of what all of ancient Rome was like, right? I mean, if you had 2 sources on the Aggie Alabama game yesterday, you'd think you were reading limited information, right? I mean, you'd be like, that one's from the Alabama perspective, that one's from the A&M perspective. I'd like to get another perspective, For the purposes of this class, of course, the A&M perspective is true. Alabama's perspective is terrible because I don't think we have anybody from Alabama in here. So we just don't have a lot of information. So the reason that I can make this statement with 100% historical accuracy is because scholars disagree. All right, they just don't know because we have one reference to the 22nd year of somebody's reign is when this guy took over. All right, they don't have dates. They don't have a chronological dating system for 400 some odd years after these events take place. So the only way they date things is the same way Luke dates them. This was the first census taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. Like back when John F. Kennedy was president, here are the things that took place. Right? They don't say like in 1962, here's what took place. All right, because they don't have a 1962 to reference. That's the much, much later dating system, nearly 500 years later. But when they find the tomb of this dude, Quirinius, it says that he was twice the legate of Syria, or twice the governor of Syria, meaning that he held the post an additional time. Which actually works out in Luke's description, because Luke in Acts chapter 5 or 6 refers to another census, and historians have thought that there were 2 censuses when Quirinius was governor of Syria, and of course St. Luke says that this was the first one, implying that there was a second one, right? So it actually works out in terms of this. But again, so this is why archaeology is our friends. We're still learning about the timeline of some of these things. But it turns out that Quirinius was governor of Syria probably twice, probably during this time frame, which is when the first census was taken, and then during this time frame when the second census was taken, which would be in total agreement with what Luke says in Acts chapter 5 or 6. Anybody know about that census in Acts 5 or 6? It was a great census. I'm sure. All right, so what's my point here? Somebody tell me what the point of all this is, talking about this dude Quirinius.
Historical fact.
We're just trying to establish, are the facts that are in the New Testament corroborated by other pieces of evidence? And if we can say yes, this lends itself to the reliability of what the New Testament authors are telling us. Because skeptics will say, well, that's just a little book of things that these guys made up. They are all agenda driven. Of course they do have an agenda, and they're very forth, right up front with what their agenda is, right? So that you would believe that Jesus is who he said he was. But the interesting thing is, as we dig deeper, we continue to find that even non-agenda driven documents corroborate the points here. Yeah, Greg.
Because the other point you're making is that eyewitnesses wrote this down. And it's not like some will say, oh, it's like the telephone game where you say one thing, pass it on, after 20 people, the story has changed.
Yeah. And that's exactly right. And if it was like a game of telephone, we would see in one of those manuscripts a significantly different version of the story. But when we have so much remarkable agreement across all the ancient manuscripts, I think it lends itself more to the conclusion like the message was faithfully passed from person to person. Right? The document was accurately copied. The other thing about eyewitnesses, and then this will be the last point we make for today, is let's say you were here at St. Lawrence this morning. Was anybody here just before the 8:30 service began? Did anybody see what happened out on the road on Kimball Avenue? Before? Uh-oh, so we have disagreement among the original sources.
I only saw the one truck, and some people would go the other way.
Yeah, there were two. Let's just say there were 2 deer.
Trotting down Kimball Avenue, there were 2 deer, literally just 2 bucks, young bucks, just trotting around, trotting down this way, and we're like, don't go that way. Turn around, you turn. So you guys saw that. So if I were to stand up here this morning and I said, listen guys, a really cool thing happened before 8:30 service this morning. There were 2 giant bears running down Kimball Avenue. What would y'all say?
No,
Like,
wrong.
the same thing that just happened, right? One person had the story from one perspective. Somebody helped them see the bigger perspective, right? This is the way all eyewitness things happen, right? People sometimes don't see the whole thing, but they help each other to see. Well, the events of Jesus did not take place kind of on the side, right? Like, let's just talk about his crucifixion. Right? Like, it was a very public event. Winding his way through crowded streets in Jerusalem, carrying a cross, right? If these are, the fact that, these guys are saying we were there were other people there that may be friendly to the version of the story that these guys want to tell. There are all kinds of people there that are unfriendly to the version of the story they want to tell. And what we don't see is we don't see a single example where somebody writes, hey, I was there on that Friday afternoon, and this is all BS. Right? Like, again, these are very public things that are happening. I mean, if the teachings, if any of the things, the gospel, 5,000 people are getting fed with 2 little fish and 5 loaves. Like, 5,000 people are there. Somebody might have written, like, actually they had a big old stash in the back. Like, this is not the way this went. Right? Like, so the fact that there are eyewitness accounts and there are other eyewitnesses, and the accounts actually work together rather than against each other. Again, this sort of is a piece of evidence that can help us to determine, is the New Testament reliable? Okay, we've got to stop. We're going to spend one more week on this, and then we're going to transition. I know you guys are bored to death of New Testament reliability, but we'll spend one more week on it because there are a couple other points to be made, and then we will move on. Susan?
I just have a very simplistic question. In my mind, I guess, I've always felt like God made sure that things were written correctly. That it was so important that this information be handed down for eons, that God made sure that everything was corroborated correctly, written down, maybe not perfectly, but he chose the people to do it, who would do the best job. That's the way
I think this is important too. There's nothing in our faith tradition that says, like, St. Luke one afternoon wrote down the entire gospel, right? Like, he penned the whole thing in one setting. Like, there isn't anything anywhere in the tradition that I am aware of that would lead us to believe that, or even need to believe that. So it's possible, and we think entirely probable, that the Gospels were produced by a collaborative effort. For instance, St. Mark is corroborating what he's learned from St. Peter. We think that's the tradition there. This is unlike, though, for instance, the reception of the Quran in Islam, where it's dictated in something like six or seven sittings and it's just out of the mind of Muhammad, and the scribes are copying as quick as they can. So that is part of the Islamic tradition. I don't think there's anything in our tradition that would lead us to want to believe that or need to believe that. In fact, I would think we'd want to believe the opposite, that the gospel writers took their time to make sure that what they're telling us is true, inspired by the Holy Spirit, in the context of the first Christian community. They remember, just a community kind of like St. Lawrence-ish. Like there are other people around. They're not like, St. John's on an island when Patmos when he writes Book of Revelation, but probably not as he writes his gospel. So they're surrounded by people. They're taking their time to make sure, I think, that what they write is accurate and true. So I think it's a helpful point. Okay, thanks guys. Hope everybody has a great week. Yes, Joanne.